Patricia, I think we should hit a nerve right now. And let's just
Okay.
touch that nerve and go straight into it. I mean, this podcast is called Mind Body Solution. And I want to ask you, should we still be differentiating between mind and body, or mind and brain for that matter?
It's interesting that you ask that question because I sometimes say to philosophers, they call certain problems mind-body problems as though the mind were not a physical part of the nervous system. And of course, all the evidence suggests that it is. So it's really the mind-mind problem, or more accurately, it's really the brain-brain problem. But of course, there are many, many aspects of what we call our psychological lives that are very poorly understood in terms of neuroscience at this stage. Yeah.
Your work I mean, you have such a diverse career. If you think about neurophilosophy, you work on conscience, eliminative materialism, there's so much for us to discuss. But I think the best place to start with this whole thing is, what to you, Patricia, is consciousness?
Oh, well, of course, nobody has a proper definition of it. Just like, until science had proceeded, nobody had a proper definition of light or a proper definition of temperature. So we can point to the typical features that are part of one's conscious life, that there's a difference between being asleep and waking up, or between being in dream sleep and being a fully awake, and between being under an anesthetic and being fully awake. We can point to those kinds of things. We could also go in a different direction and talk about the fact that we can be aware of smells and tastes and so forth, and that somehow attention seems to be a function, although at this point, I think neurobiology is not sure that it really is a function, but that it seems to be, and that when we focus on one thing as opposed to another, that the thing on which we're focusing, we're conscious, but the other thing, even though if we were focusing on it, it would be conscious, we don't notice it. And so there's a lot that goes on around us of which we're not conscious, but more importantly, there's a lot that goes on in our brains that we will never have conscious access to.
I know there was a part in your career where you worked very closely with neurologists. You went to walk around surgical, you saw neurosurgeries, and coming from a medical perspective, I mean, I've seen it. You tweak and touch a little part of the brain, and you can fundamentally change a person. So why do you think we're still having this big debate? Why do you think philosophers are still at it regarding the mind-body problem?
I don't think most serious philosophers are having a debate about it. I mean, there are some individuals who like to think that consciousness in particular is a fundamental feature of the universe, along with mass, charge, and spin. But there's not any evidence whatever for that idea. And I don't think, I mean, quite honestly, I've not had much to do with philosophers in the recent past, but those who call themselves neurophilosophers certainly don't buy into that. And most neurobiologists don't buy into that. I mean, they think many, many problems about the nature of the brain are extremely difficult. I mean, like, how do you hold things in working memory for many seconds, maybe even 10 or 15 seconds? How does that happen? I don't know. How is it that you're able to learn skills and exercise those skills, like throwing a ball or doing mathematics? We don't understand those things. We understand certain very minimalist things about how certain reflexes might work, and we're making bits of progress elsewhere. But these are difficult problems that in two ways. One is that they require very sophisticated methods and tools and devices to access nervous systems. And the other is, we're really learning this now, and you really see this amongst the neuroscientists, is that we've been thinking about brain functions in terms of how we describe our psychology, like wondering about things or fearing things. And maybe some of the categories we're using are like old-fashioned categories in physics, like sublunary physics and superlunary physics. I mean, whoever talks about that anymore? And what's the connection between sublunary and superlunary physics? Nobody cares. Nobody even remembers that. And nobody even remembers anymore that biologists, until about 1952, some biologists were totally in love with the idea of vitalism. And vitalism actually is a perfect echo for these people like David Chalmers, who says that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe. Vitalists don't have any argument, nor does Chalmers. Right? He has no evidence at all. So what does he have? What he has is, look, it's dead obvious that you can't get livingness out of dead molecules. Okay, that's the vitalist. Here's Chalmers. It's dead obvious that you can't get feelings out of mere stuff. Same deal. No evidence. No appreciation of how science might evolve in order to accommodate these kinds of questions and in order to make progress. I mean, nobody at this stage should feel confident in saying we will be able to answer these questions. You don't make predictions like that in science. But it's better than Chalmers just saying there's no point in trying.
Chalmers defines the hard problem. Then you've got someone like Ned Block who's differentiating between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Then you've got people like Dennett who's quieting qualia completely. And then you also have, so there's the illusionist theories and then eliminative materialism. Let's briefly touch on that because that also formed part of the big philosophical history of this. What got you and Paul to come to this conclusion? How did you guys get there?
Well, first of all, I should say something about eliminative materialism. Paul and I, that is Paul Churchland, my husband, and I, never, ever thought that consciousness wasn't real. Of course it's real. The question is whether it emerges from neuronal activity or not. And so that's one thing. But the other thing about eliminative materialism was this, that we had the idea that some psychological theories about how we work use concepts that are really very ancient and old and quite serviceable in their way, but that as we come to know more and more about the nature of the brain, some of those concepts are going to change and be revised. And so, and of course, memory is the great case in point. We already know now, many neuroscientists don't talk about memory anymore. They talk about kinds of plasticity because there are so many different kinds of systems that play a role in this sort of plasticity and learning and that sort and this sort and that sort and so forth. So that's kind of a comment about eliminative materialism. And I just should say as an aside, when we were talking about these things initially, and when I was initially up to my years in neuroscience, we were at the University of Manitoba. We were little nothing bald nobodies. And Paul wanted to publish this paper saying our concepts may be revised and changed in the way that we got rid of the idea of caloric fluid, for example, or the idea that there are two levels of physics, sublunary and superlunar. And he felt, because this was really the culture of philosophy at that time, that you had to kind of give this approach a name. And so we kind of went through the literature, and there was Richard Rorty, who was very famous and who was at Princeton, who had something like a similar idea. And he called his idea eliminative materialism. And Paul thought, well, that's probably good enough, even though that's not really what we're talking about. And so he called it that. And of course, in retrospect, we wish that we hadn't called it anything. But then, in philosophy in those days, if you didn't have an ism, well, nobody paid any attention to you. So that was thing one. And thing two is we really should have called it revisionary materialism, meaning that, the old framework is likely to be revised in just the ways that we are seeing that it actually is now being revised. So that was kind of the story. I mean, it's, like a story of a lot of life where certain decisions seem like they're really major, and it turns out it was because you couldn't find your socks. And all kinds of minor things play into decisions that come to be viewed later as very major.
Because I can imagine the backlash, people just assuming that you're saying that nothing really exists or not. There's no.
Oh yes, it was, and most people didn't bother to read us.
That's the thing.
And one guy from Rutgers
is what you're talking about.
Pardon me?
I said you're talking about this folk psychological revision. It's just all about changing the terms we're using to describe certain actions.
That was it.
Things, yeah.
We didn't want to say there wasn't such a thing as memory or belief, but that those concepts might be revised once we could look at things from the point of view of the brain. And the inspiration here really were the other sciences, including physics, including chemistry, including biology. I mean, you think about people who fairly recently thought that the elements were earth, air, fire, and water. Well, no, it's not really so. and so our idea really was that the brain could turn out to work in ways that are very surprising to us from a folk psychological point of view. And it was we were allowed to have these kinds of speculations because, as I said, we were in the University of Manitoba, which most people had never heard of, and we were total nobodies. And so, we had this gang of folks from the philosophy department, and we'd talk about these things and write about them, and we never expected anything much to come of it.
And clearly a lot did. I mean,
a lot ended up. Yes, it did. It did.
It's so when people think of eliminative materialism, a lot of people today think of illusionism because, I mean, Keith Frankish, Dennett, Graziano, people. How do you feel about these two theories being linked together? And do you consider yourself an illusionist in that sense?
I actually don't pay very much attention to it. I mean, we know that the brain is a constructive and generative organ. I mean, that's one of the things that I really like about Michael Graziano's approach to these things. We know all that, and we know that when sensory signals come in, whether it's via the retina or via touch sensors or what have you, that they are often, as it were, manipulated and processed in such a way that they're not necessarily completely faithful to what's out there, but good enough a representation of what's out there to enable you to do the job so that you survive and thrive. And I mean, then it seems to have just a thing about, going on about illusion. Okay. I mean, I honestly do not spend time reading. I really don't see that there's any percentage in there. And ditto with Keith Frankish. I mean, I can't imagine that these people really understand enough of neurobiology to be helping us move the project further. What they want to do is put out something that is faintly exotic and attention getting. Okay. Get on with it.
It's a nice word.
I'm a bit of a critic of some of my fellows, even though I like them personally a lot.
It's crazy because when you think about it, I know when I think about the term cognitive science or the word cognitive science, someone like Chomsky comes to mind. And like now that's what's become of neurophilosophy with you. If you say the word neurophilosophy, you are the first person to come to anyone's mind.
And they have a great time sort of trying to kick the crap out of me. Yeah. Oh yeah, they do. And yeah. But, you know, I mean, there's some things you want to care about in life and some things you don't. And what I'm really interested in is making progress in neuroscience in ways that are substantive and on issues where there is real evidence. Doesn't mean that we're going to get it right the first time or the first few times, but for example, with regard to social neuroscience and these very interesting phenomena of caring between individuals in mammalian species as well as in avian species, I just find that really, really interesting. And I'm not particularly keen to read people who are telling me that, you know, panpsychism, there's only so many hours in the day. And I got the basic story from these guys, and to hear more about it is just a waste of my time.
Yeah, I know, because what you want is for the theory to be practical, to have some sort of a practical.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you want to.
Absolutely.
Panpsychism for you is something that you just cannot apply to anything in terms of like medicine, psychiatry.
No.
Yeah.
And there's a certain respect in which I think you're right. I think it's very frivolous. I mean, here we have something upwards of 300 major diseases of nervous systems for which we can claim real understanding of none. Parkinson's may be more than certain others, but we don't know why the substantia nigra degenerates in such a way that dopamine ceases to be produced and all of these terrible effects happen to people with Parkinson's. And so we know a little more about Parkinson's. We know almost nothing about schizophrenia, which affects 1% of the population. And so when somebody says, well, you know, I don't really care about the brain because, you know, it's the conscious experience is a fundamental feature of the universe, I think, okay, well, fine, you do your thing. There are serious people trying to understand neurobiological diseases. And as we come to understand those diseases, we also come to understand much about normal brains.
Yeah, because when you look at an atypical brain, so we're often studying typical brains, but the atypical brains give you so much more information. You get to see exactly where things go wrong, how you can apply it. I mean, Michael Graziano, even Michael Gazzaniga, when you look at his split brain work, I mean, that's fascinating stuff.
Oh, I mean, Michael Gazzaniga's work with Sperry was one of the things that really changed my mind about whether philosophy was really doing anything serious about teaching us about the nature of, amongst other things, conscious experience. I mean, the basic point was if you can cut a fiber of nerves between one cortical side and the other cortical side, as a result of which consciousness is split, you are really in a dilemma if you think consciousness is independent of the brain, that it's a soul thing or an ethereal thing or whatever. And I thought it was a monumental discovery. And then what Michael went on to do, I think, in studying split brain patients was just profound.
Yeah, to see just
so I think Gazzaniga is one of the major figures, even though he had this, you know, falling out with Sperry, which whoever knows, I'm not very interested in that, the sociology of that. But Gazzaniga was a major influence in changing people's mind about what philosophy could and couldn't do.
I feel exactly the same way. That's exactly what happened to me, because it started off with reading his books. And then I went on to read Michael Gazzaniga's work, and then completely changed the way I saw consciousness, the way I saw the brain, how we are as people. I mean, there's clearly no unitary thing. There's no unity, ethereal essence to this. It's easy to tweak. It's easy to touch. Paul Broks, I think, was one of the authors who says when you open the skull, you think you're going to see all the things like feelings, emotions, etc. All you see are vessels, blood, nerves, tissue. That's it.
Yeah. I know it is quite extraordinary, but it's also extraordinary when you go on a neurological ward, as you know, and you see patients with certain really unusual symptoms of regarding speech, for example, or regarding what they can and can't see, and to know that there are very specific kinds of damage in the brain that leads to these things. So that's important as well.
But
In Manitoba, when I was looking at patients or going to neurology and neurosurgical rounds, multiple sclerosis was one of the things we saw quite frequently, because, as you know, in the northern climates, for reasons that are still opaque, the incidence of multiple sclerosis goes up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, Patricia, what do you think about, I mean, clearly you're saying, look, mind is brain. This is all happening in the brain. This is a fundamentally neuronal process that's creating our experiences. But why are we struggling then so much in psychiatry? I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm just a medical doctor who has a special interest in mental health. But this is considered the third biological revolution. I mean, we've had multiple ones. Now we think that with fMRIs, with correlates of consciousness, with correlates of experience, we're going to figure out so much. And why are we failing? If it's all in the brain, why is it so difficult for us to figure out what's happening in this mind?
Well, I think it's a really good question. And of course, as these things are, I mean, as problems are in any science, it always comes down to what tools you have and what techniques you have. And while it's true that, for example, with regard to schizophrenia, we don't really see anything gross. Bear in mind that we're using MR. What's the spatial resolution and the temporal resolution of MR? It's not great. So there must be differences. We just don't know at what level we're going to be able to find those differences. And I mean, there is some evidence now that what you need to look at, because there is typically some sort of genetic basis to schizophrenia, what you need to look at are very tiny differences in development having to do with dendritic organization in particular. And in particular cell types, on particular levels of cortex and particular kinds. But these are at a level that you're never going to see with a scan. And of course, so that presents a real difficulty, because we don't do experiments on humans that are invasive and that involve going into the brain and taking out a big chunk and saying, let's have a look at this. But it can be done with mice, where what we know how to do is to produce in the mouse genome something of the genes that we think are implicated in schizophrenia, and then to watch at every stage of development how those mice grow and what the changes in the brain look like, and whether there are significant differences between those mice and, so to speak, normal mice, and whether you see anything in behavior. So I think it's an imperfect approach. But at this stage, I think it's about the best we can do. And it's at that stage where people are saying the results of having these schizophrenic style genes in mice is you see changes in basic features of wiring and of pruning back wiring at a very, very early level.
I'm trying to think like a solution to this problem. I mean, what about taking into account, what are your thoughts then on, I'm not sure if you heard of 4E cognition, like it's one of these, this group of people who believe that we're embodied beings embedded in a society that we continuously have to enact upon. And what
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, yes, I have a body, and yes, I have family and friends and all that. But of course, their effects on me are via my sensory receptors, and then the effects change the brain. So I never quite got what was supposed to be the big lesson of embodied cognition.
Yeah, because I think where they're trying to come from is with trying to build artificial intelligence, and the more they're trying
Well,
to
yeah.
realizing that implementing certain bodily movements that we have, or doing certain things that we do with our physical apparatus, seems to affect the psychology as well somehow. And I think that's where they're coming from. I'm not sure if you.
Yeah, well, yeah, probably. My father had polio when he was 4. So did that affect his body? Well, yes, he had one leg that was somewhat withered, so he couldn't run, and he walked with a limp, and that meant he couldn't join the army, so he did something else. Yeah, it does have an effect, but I didn't need a whole bunch of people in embodied cognition to tell me that.
Mm.
I mean, I think everybody knows that. So I'm not quite sure. I think probably I'm missing something important here that I just haven't put enough time into, and that they may have an idea for research into something like schizophrenia.
Yes.
Where I haven't appreciated it. I mean, we know that the genetic disposition for schizophrenia is not 100%. The concordance between identical twins for schizophrenia is not 100%. It's somewhere around 70%. So what are the influences in the environment? Nobody really knows. I mean, they could be that the family was using lead water pipes, and one twin was slightly more susceptible than the other. I mean, we really don't know, and it doesn't help very much to answer that question, to be told that we're embodied. I mean, I don't mind the idea that they want to emphasize this, but I mean, there has been, I think, a real investigation into the idea with regard to the twin studies, that one twin might be abused or might have a more stressful environment. Not very much has actually come out of that at this point. So it's tough. And it may be that the mouse studies will give us ideas that we can test at the macro level, at the human level. But so far, there's a lot of work to be done.
And of course, we have to always take into account the evolutionary processes that go into all of this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love that you also do that particularly when you're talking about a conscience and how we approach moral situations, moral dilemmas. Let's discuss that a bit, but let's start off with what would be the evolutionary purpose of developing some sort of a conscious system that's able to do what we do right now?
You mean a system that is aware, or a system that cares about things?
Let's start off with awareness.
Awareness. Well, I mean, that's hard to say, because one of the things we don't really understand are the differences that came about in brain function and behavioral capacity as a result of getting cortex. So really only mammals have cortex. Birds have an analog of cortex, by virtue of which they're very, very capable of very complex behavior. But only mammals have this 6-layer structure, as you know, with very specific cell types on very specific levels, with very specific kinds of functions and kinds of connectivity and so forth. And ultimately, the story of the kind of consciousness that mammals have is got to be related to that.
Mm.
And it may be that you don't really need to have a kind of narrowing down of, in the way Graziano thinks of it, the kind of narrowing down of what you're cognitively working on if you don't have cortex. But once you have cortex, then it's essential to have some way, because otherwise the brain is just going to be overwhelmed by stuff. You've got to have some way of moving around and clumping together stuff that's irrelevant to the immediate purpose. But I'm just waving my hands here. We don't really know. And we don't really know whether fruit flies have something that's analogous to consciousness. I mean, we know that they sleep. And we know that they do something that's akin to rapid eye movement sleep, which in our case we think has got a lot to do with dreaming.
Yeah.
And they call it rapid leg movement sleep. But the little guys sit there on a wire and they snooze. Why? And it's interesting to me that we still do not understand why all of us have to sleep, including the modest little fruit fly. I'm not sure whether C. elegans, the worm that has only about 300 neurons, I don't know whether C. elegans sleeps, but my impression is that it takes a nap now and again.
Why do you think we sleep? Why do you think we
I don't know. I don't know. I'm waiting for science to come up with the answers, and I think it will surprise us. I mean, for normal people, you say, well, why do you need to sleep? And the answer is because I'm tired. But why are we tired?
Yeah.
Don't know. I mean, I think lots of us speculate that there's a very deep biological reason why we sleep. Otherwise, you wouldn't see it in even fruit flies. Why? Well, because when you sleep, you're quite vulnerable. I mean, there's that little fruit fly sitting on its wire, having a snooze. You could take it off. So sleep is dangerous. And if you see it as far back as invertebrates like fruit flies, Mother Nature was forced to play that hand for some reason. And it's probably very deep and very biological and has nothing to do with, you know, fancy psychological things or high-level psychological things. I think it's a very deep biological thing. It must be if fruit flies have to sleep too. So I don't have a theory about it. I'd love to know.
And also, I can't wait for someone to give us some deep insights. I mean, yes. Is, if you go into like a vivid dream, it's a lot like a hallucination for when you psychiatric patients. I mean, the way they describe reality, I mean, sleep's pretty much kind of that when you're having a dream.
Yeah.
It's almost a different version of consciousness. It's just that your body's not responding to the stimuli that's occurring.
Yes, I mean, your brain actually has a mechanism to prevent you from moving, except for your eyes. But it prevents you from getting up and acting out your dream. So that's also, I mean, that's a big deal. And that's not true only of humans. That's why your dog can be lying on his bed and having a dream, his eyes are moving on, but it can't do very much. Yeah. And it's quite funny to watch, but we know we do the same things.
Exactly. And we also get people with conditions where they do act out their dreams.
Yes.
That's another fascinating aspect of it.
It is a fascinating thing. And then they have to have dream suppressants so they don't get up and hurt themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've developed over time, I mean, neuroevolutionary. Why have we developed this moral intuition? How have we done this? What's going on here?
Well, I think that sociality can be a very beneficial thing in certain species. And we do see social bees, for example, other social insects like termites or social fish. But in the case of mammals and birds, we do see something really rather unique. And that has to do with the flexibility of the caring, the long-lasting nature of the caring of one individual for another. And so the way I tend to look at this is that for Mother Nature, something very deep had to happen in order for the caring system, if I may put it that way, for the caring system to kick in. And my guess, but we don't know this for sure, is that it's linked to the fact that endothermy, being able to produce your own bodily warmth, appeared about 200 million years ago. Now, what's endothermy got to do with it? And here's the answer. Endothermy is hugely advantageous. It means you can forage at night, for example. And we think that the early endotherms were quite small, although once there were so many of them, they began to compete with each other, then size changed. But endothermy, although it's very advantageous, comes with a cost. And the cost is this. Gram for gram, an endotherm has to eat 10 times as much. It needs 10 times the calorie. So that puts a huge constraint on the emerging endotherms. And one way to deal with this huge energy requirement is to be smarter than the competition. That is, to have structures that allow for finer discrimination, better predictions about how they're going to behave, capacities for retaining what things are around that you can't immediately respond to, but you know are there, and so forth. And that's roughly speaking what I mean by being smart. And so we see the emergence of this completely new structure that you do not see in turtles or lizards or snakes, and that is cortex. And now, basically, Mother Nature must have said to herself, well, look, if we're going to have this structure that makes the endotherm smart, it can only do so by being very immature at birth and then maturing in response to the world, in response to experience. And that is, of course, what happens. And so that's really a great idea, Mother Nature. But if the cortex is going to have to be that immature, other structures will have to be somewhat less mature than they normally are in a turtle. And now the thing is going to be born vulnerable. A turtle is not born very vulnerable. It's small, but it can scramble out of the egg and go down to the water. But a mouse is born deaf and blind and hairless. And all it can do is sort of scrabble around, find a warm thing that sticks out and suck on it. So Mother Nature now has a problem. And that is, if you're going to have a cortex that is immature enough to be of use to you in being smart, you have to be born immature. And that means you have to have something to take care of you. Who would that be, says Mother Nature? Well, the mom, she's right there. So essentially what you do if you're Mother Nature at this point, I mean, over many evolutionary eons, what happened was that the structure of the ancient brain, the hypothalamus and related structures, changed to accommodate caring for another. It's as though there were structures in place that allow me to care for myself. I see to my own food and water and safety. Now, just tweak those a little bit so that in addition to my own care, I care for my babies. And so that's essentially, it's kind of like taking self-love and expanding it to your offspring. And once you've done that, that is, you've got the genes in place to ensure that the wiring is in place to ensure that you feel this connection to the other. then you can begin to tweak it in more and more and more in interesting ways. And so we see essentially all mammalian mothers are devoted to their babies unless they are drug addicts or, something else. And many of them, well, I shouldn't say that, about 5% also form strong attachments to mates. Beavers do, voles do, marmoset monkeys do, TT monkeys do, and humans pretty much do. And in birds, the mate connection, the bonding, long-term bonding of mates is about 98%. And you can kind of see from an evolutionary perspective why that would be. I mean, if you're a mother bird and you've got to feed yourself, you've got to leave your eggs and they're vulnerable. And if you watch birds, of course, you see that they take turns.
They do.
Minding the nest. So I think that's where caring came from. And depending on the ecology, then it turns out that you may have your strongest attachments to your daughters and their daughters and their daughters, as the baboons do. They don't have long-term mate caring, but they have these matrilines that matter very much. And so there are many different ways in which, as a function of, happenstance and ecology, different ways of having social groups emerged. And we're just one amongst others.
I mean, it's intriguing because you somehow have transitioned from neurophilosophy to neuroethics. What took you down this route, this change of?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question because at various times in my philosophical career as an undergraduate, graduate student and so forth, people would be very sure about utilitarianism or whatever. And I think, I can't get it. I just can't get it. And I never expected in my lifetime to be able to think scientifically about social behavior and hence about moral behavior. And that all changed one day in about 2005, I guess, when Larry Young, who is a neurobiologist at Emory University, Larry Young came to give a talk about voles. And he was giving this talk at the Salk, and I used to go to pretty much all the talks that were there. That was just part of the thing, because they were always wonderful. So he starts off, and it's kind of boring, and I'm sort of thinking, oh dear, I hope this is going to get good. And suddenly, he talked about prairie voles that mate for life. And the question was, what's the difference in the brain between voles that mate for life and voles that don't mate? That mate, but don't bond. And he went on to describe very specific structures in the old part of the brain, in the hypothalamus, where you could see differences in density in the prairie vole, high density, for receptors for something I'd never really paid attention to, oxytocin. Whereas the montane vole, not bonders, had very little in the way of receptors. And of course, they had done all of the manipulations and experiments and so forth. And I walked out of there thinking, this is unbelievable, that something like long-term bonding, which, I think many humans thought was, first of all, unique to us. And it's because we were moral creatures. Oh, no. It turns out it's a fundamental, basic biological phenomenon about density of receptors for this ancient molecule, oxytocin. And I just walked out of there and sat in the sun. And then I think I had lunch with Larry Young after that. And I thought, there is a way to understand moral behavior, or at least some aspects of it. That show why we care, that will come out of this story. So it completely took me by surprise. Never expected it to happen.
And now that you're on this course, what are you finding? What are you noticing in terms of, when I read Conscience, I think I read it a year ago. I haven't had a chance to read it again before this interview, but I remember thinking, I mean, you spoke about utilitarianism, Kantian, ethics, this, I mean, all the diversity of choices people have, but clearly there's no one option for.
No, there isn't.
People want to have this easy answer where you can
Yeah, it's not there.
yeah, exactly. And what have you found that shows us that it's not there and that it's probably never going to be there?
Well, I think it's easy enough to show in terms of the reasons why utilitarianism doesn't work. That is because there are many situations where the utilitarian answer is the morally obnoxious answer. For example, if there are a small minority of people and what you're trying to do is maximize happiness in general, then you can maximize the happiness of the majority by taking from the minority their money, their organs, their whatever. I mean, and that's okay as far as utilitarianism is concerned, but it isn't okay. We know that. And that's just one simple example. The philosopher Simon Blackburn, who was at Cambridge for many years, has I think really shown again and again the weaknesses in supposing that utilitarianism always applies. Now, it's not that the consequences don't matter. It's that we have to learn as we grow up in a culture when certain things matter, when other things matter more, and it's, I think, one of the most complicated things that humans do, and we often get it wrong. We think we're doing the moral thing, and then you rear back and you think, oh my God, I didn't see that thus and such could happen.
Yes.
So I think it's extraordinarily complicated, and at the cognitive level, I think we know very little. But by and large, the philosophers have not been interested in this. They just think, oh, there she goes on biology again.
Well, when you think about that, it's the most infamous thought experiment about the train, the 5 people on the right.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a long period where philosophers discussed the choices that people would make. Would you either press the button, switch the track, kill the 5 people, or would you push the person over the cliff? But recently, after we now have scans and we're able to use neuroscience to assist, now we can see the psychology behind it. When you're behind a button, it's more of an analytical problem. It's prefrontal cortex. Right. And so we are kind of learning things about the brain that can assist us.
I think so. And there were psychologists who said, as soon as you introduce real data into this. If you say, for example, Putin is the man on the train and the Ukrainians are on the other track, you get a completely different answer than if you say Zelensky is on the train and there's Russian generals who and so forth. He showed that if you go into a shopping mall and just ask regular passersby to answer some of these questions, you get answers that are very different from what undergraduates at Irvine will say. And I think that undermined the confidence also that this was a problem, a moral problem that taught us very much in the way that people had originally thought.
I feel like,
but moral issues are just really, really, really difficult. And even what seem like simple things, like I remember being in the Arctic and being on a trip with Inuit people, and at one point offering to help, and think, what? And I thought, why were they so offended? And the answer is, you don't offer help just casually, because it means the other person is incompetent and might soon, be off on the ice floes. And so there is something that seems so easy, but it's not.
It's culturally diverse as well.
It's very diverse culture. And people say, oh no, that means nothing is really right or wrong and everything is relative. And That's not really right either. But on the other hand, the idea that there are these absolute moral rules that somehow come from God or our brain or the dog or something, that's not right either. I mean, we like to have certain amount of, in a very complex society like ours, as opposed to, say, an Inuit group of 30 people. In a complex society, you need to have laws, and people need to understand precisely what the laws say and what the punishment is if you break the law and so forth. But until the advent of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, there were no written laws, but people got on. You know, they managed.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
When you look at the neuroscientific revolution that's taking place and everything that's happening, I mean, I just spoke to Greg Caruso the other day, and we were discussing neuroexistentialism. How do you feel? Because I know you're also part of this. Neuroexistentialism. How do you feel people are going to deal with this information that, look, we don't really know if we're in full control. We don't know whether there are any universal ethics. It's this third wave of us just living in a world where we're absurdly free. How do we cope? How do we deal? What is the spirituality that we're going to have here? What's going to keep everything grounded?
Oh dear, I haven't actually put any time into so-called neuroexistentialism. I think in order to do it, you would need to, in order to do it in a useful way, instead of just a spouting off sort of way, you'd really need to know more about how people did manage very well in small groups for long periods. I mean, for almost all of human history. And they did manage without having absolute laws, and they sort of knew probably that their capacities were somewhat constrained by their abilities. I quite honestly, this sounds like a make work project. I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but
I don't think you ever mean to be rude, but I'm sure people are still going to get offended.
oh, they definitely will. I mean, you know, somebody comes along and says, well, there's neuroexistentialism. Don't you think people are now going to fall apart? No, I don't actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I know lots of people here in San Diego in the military. They're not going to fall apart. I know lots of my neighbors who work in tech. I don't see them falling apart. Well, yeah, of course, yeah. I don't know. I'm sorry. I would like to be more positive about this and say something really deep and profound, but I don't think anybody has anything deep and profound to say.
Do you think we have free will?
Well, I think we have a capacity for control. All mammals do. Lots and lots of lizards and turtles and snakes do have a capacity for control, and it changes as animals develop and learn. It's very easy to see mammalian control at work in the case of a predator, as the predator has to organize to manage to bring down a prey. And there's, like, for example, there's this wonderful videotape of a grizzly bear, a female with 2 cubs, and there's a somewhat lame caribou and a stream. She wants that caribou. And she has to, at the same time, make sure that she doesn't get hurt and the cubs don't get hurt. And she exercises just the most astonishing control as she slowly eases this caribou into the stream. He thinks he's charging her, and she just moves and moves until they're in the stream, and now his footing won't be so sure. She lures him in a bit deeper, checks that, growls at the cubs to get back. And they're watching intently, of course. And then what she does is she goes forward to him. His rack is like this, and she just falls in between the rack, pulls him down, lies on him, and drowns him. That's huge amount of control.
That is.
No surviving predator now just runs at their prey. They sneak up on them. In the case of wolves, they have to have self-control amongst the whole group. They have to know what everybody is doing. Otherwise, they can't. Otherwise, they starve. They can't bring the animal down.
Mm.
And do we have self-control? Yes, and it can be undercut by various things, like you
Like
go
on a
to the
spectrum.
and you go to the pub, and but yes, of course we have self-control, and that's got to be good enough.
Mm.
We certainly also have major systems that move our attention in very important ways, towards sex, for example, or towards care of offspring, towards making friends beyond the immediate family, and all that kind of thing. But somehow philosophers, unfortunately, I think, have talked themselves into the idea that either your behavior is caused or it's uncaused.
Mm.
And of course, behavior is caused, but it's just that you can, through exercise, through experience, you can learn to modify circuitry. And the circuitry changes the degree of control that you have. And parents who don't teach any kids any kind of control often are rather uncontrolled as adults. And then they have to either learn pretty fast or they get into trouble pretty fast.
I know.
So we're biological animals like wolves and monkeys and chimpanzees.
I know that I think it's Robert Sapolsky. I mean, he wrote his book Behave, where it's about how each aspect of control starts very young, from developmental, moving upward.
Absolutely, yeah.
Weeks to months to days. I mean, hormones taking place over time. So when you take that into account, because he's very scared, he's a skeptic. He doesn't believe we have free will. When you take into account the fact that everything's kind of taking place systematically to get to this point, almost like Laplace's demon, does that make you question whether this is really happening via your own volition, and this is really happening because you made an active decision right now?
It's hard for me to understand. I mean, it might be like asking the question, how can this be real love? If what it involves is estrogen and testosterone, and my hormones are changing my brain. I mean, how can it be real love if all of those things are involved? Or how can I really love my child if my hypothalamus is producing oxytocin that binds to receptors and other regions of the brain? How can that be real parental love? And I think, look, you are what you are. And maybe you just need to live with the real conception of yourself as opposed to some romantic conception of yourself, some made up conception of yourself. I'm quite content with the fact that there are circuits, and circuits can change, but they can't change monumentally, especially at later stages of life. So just don't expect too much, maybe.
It's strange because it's almost like the reverse of an eliminative materialistic view. You kind of
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, kind of went on the flip side there. A lot of people probably get shocked by that.
Yeah, they might be. I don't know, but that's because most people who really dislike the idea of eliminative materialism have never read anything we've ever written. They just hear from somebody else that we're eliminative materialists, and that's really dumb. But that's okay.
But so this podcast, when I started it, I mean, the main goal was just discuss the mind-body problem, and then obviously every topic that comes around that: free will, spirituality, morality, mortality, even. In terms of spiritual views, what was your journey like growing up? What was your religion? Are you religious? What are your views regarding life, the afterlife, etc.?
Yeah, well, the afterlife, it doesn't look good. I mean, there's not much to go after, right? I mean, once the neurons die, that's kind of it. Um, and so I think you do the best for your life right here.
Mm,
And sometimes what you can also do is hope to make things easier or better or somehow more wonderful for those, not necessarily family, but maybe only family, for those who come later, and care about the planet. So my growing up was it was a Protestant religion that my mother adhered to, and my father always had to fix the tractor on Sunday for some reason. And so he never actually went to church. And as a kid, of course, you figure out quite early on that the tractor is a bit of an excuse. And so I would sit with him and talk about these things. And he'd say, well, and I think this was actually quite reasonable at the time. He'd say, well, sometimes it's good to have religious communities because they provide a social context for people to do things that are important in life,
mhm.
to marry people, to bury people, to help people get through tough times. And so as a social organization, it can be a good thing.
Mm.
Um, and I think he found it very difficult to buy into any exotic metaphysics. But he did have an understanding that social life is really important. And the social life, this was a small farming community, so maybe our church had, I don't know, 150 members. But that they shared certain ideas and outlooks was very, very important. And they were fairly critical of the Catholic Church because my mother didn't like the Pope because he was a man and he was supposed to be celibate, and ha ha ha, everybody knew that was that was made up. And because unlike the Protestant church, where you're supposed to figure out your moral dilemma with discussion and help and advice, but ultimately it's your decision. They didn't like the idea that the Pope and the priest would tell you what was right or wrong. They just felt that was not something they could buy into.
Mm.
But I had lots of friends who were Catholics, and we were quite kind and reasonable to the local priest. He used to buy our peaches and things like that. So it wasn't that there was any sort of real religious hostility. It was really, and I think these kinds of things are probably typical of small towns. You get on with everybody because, this is a small town and you don't want to
You have to
make
keep
life miserable for yourself and others. Yeah.
so you didn't grow up very religious. You were.
No, I didn't. But with certain, respect for what some religions at least were trying to do. And of course, as an adult, the recognition of the real disasters that befell the Catholic Church as a result of their screwball rules for priests, that was kind of no surprise, but it also was very heartbreaking to see how damaging it had been to so many people.
Mm.
And it's also kind of worrisome, I guess, that the church has not really managed to bring itself to change in any fundamental way the nature of the organization.
Yeah, it's almost.
But I had an uncle who went to work in Africa in about 1948 he was a logging, he filed saws, in other words, he made saws sharp.
Mhm.
And he came back from Africa with these wonderful stories about these people in Nigeria and how they lived and how they got on and how their religions were different and ways in which they were both charming and surprising. And I think that was helpful, but also of course we didn't have television or anything like that, but my dad subscribed to the National Geographic, and that opened our eyes too to how other people did things and how other religions organized things and had different kinds of ideas about things. And yeah, I think that was very helpful.
Do you think religion sort of, what do you think is doing a better job at creating a better moral landscape for us? Do you think religion did that for us better, or do you think science is doing that for us better?
I don't know. I mean, that's a very, very difficult question because there's a lot of interplay between those two things. I mean, there are lots of scientists who have a religion of some kind or other. I mean, there's a huge, big spectrum of that. As a devotee of yoga, I've been doing yoga for about 25 years, and I don't feel like I need to buy into the metaphysics of it. And the metaphysics of it in most of my classes is fairly minimal.
Mm.
But I appreciate why the metaphysics is there and what people are trying to achieve by it, and their recognition that often our impulses kind of lead us to do things which, if we could pause and deeply breathe and think it through first, we would never do. And I mean, gosh, that's got to be useful.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I agree. Something I was thinking about earlier when you spoke about the prairie voles, Lisa Feldman Barrett brought up the exact same thing when she was discussing it. I mean, so these prairie voles have clearly changed a lot of people's views.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of things. I mean, even when you see someone, when a mom gives birth, the amount of oxytocin that gets released immediately afterwards, there's just this attachment, this connection. When you're looking at societies and the way people have diversified and the way we're all looking at different ethics, what are your thoughts then on like these new movements? Let's say, for example, effective altruism, or like something like that, where we should help others outside of our social group, because this is clearly we have an ingrained social wanting or longing for each other, but within an immediate group.
Yeah, I know. I've thought a little bit about the idea of effective altruism, where you don't, first of all, think of those in your community. You think, who really needs what I'm about to give? I think it's a little bit unrealistic, shall I say. That is, I think it's terribly important when individuals, maybe who don't have a terrifically sophisticated education, but who do good things and make sacrifices for others. If they're told that they really need to change and take a broader view, I have a friend who runs a salon, and one Saturday a week, she takes her tools and she goes down to the section in San Diego where there's a lot of homeless people, and she cuts their hair. Now, I think that's just wonderful. And I asked her about it and why she does it and so forth. And she said, it helps people to have even a little bit of dignity. And if they can't wash or they can't cut their hair, then that dignity is imperiled and they really go downhill. And I thought that was a wonderful answer. And I thought, if I were an effective altruist, would I really say to my friend, look, you could work on Saturday and then take that money and send it to, I don't know, Guatemala, and maybe do more good. And you know what? That would be stupid. It would be stupid because, first of all, she has immediate contact with these people whose hair she's cutting. And that's good for them. But it also, there's something very deep about her doing this for them that must give her a kind of satisfaction. that you wouldn't get from just sending a check to the Guatemala help the poor charity. So when people from effective altruism say those sorts of things, I hesitate. I mean, I think they mean well, but I do hesitate because I think the actual social interactions whereby we help people and know those people makes a difference. I mean, we're not, humans are smart. We got these big fat brains and all that kind of stuff, but we are very deeply biological creatures. So I anyway.
Makes me think of the selfish gene. I mean, Richard Dawkins, when you think about it, I mean, still there is this element when helping someone else where you're still looking out for yourself.
I don't think so.
Well, your gene, at least.
Well, I mean, I think that what Richard got wrong about the selfish gene was he said that morality has to be taught to people because they are inherently, completely and thoroughly selfish. That's just not true. We know that about parents and offspring. And we know that about lots of people who within their community have attachments to others so that they help them. They actually incur a cost, never to be repaid. They incur a cost to help others. And I think you might say, well, yeah, but they get satisfaction from it. I mean, well, but does the satisfaction ever really compensate for the cost of what they're actually doing? I think in some cases, pretty obviously not.
I haven't read the book in a long time, so I can't remember. But what I think there was an element of, if you do help that person, let's say, there is a chance that at some point that person might help you. In another case.
I don't think that's what's going on. My salon lady does not think that any of these homeless people are going to ever be able to help her. I need to take a very quick break. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you. All right,
Patricia, I just want to read something from your website, actually. The fundamental questions from Plato onwards are these. How is it possible for us to represent reality? How is it that we can represent an external world of objects, of space and time, of motion and color? How do we represent the inner world of thought and desire, images and ideas, self and consciousness? Where do moral values come from? Since it's after all the nervous system that achieves these things, the fundamental questions can be reformulated thus. How does the brain, situated in its bodily configuration, within its surrounding physical environment, and within the social context it finds itself, how does the brain work? I think that's such a beautiful phrase.
Oh, thank you. Well, I do kind of believe that. Yeah. Yeah, I do. I do.
Something that comes to mind immediately is, again, mental health. We seem to be in some sort of a peak epidemic, and yet a lot of the studies are very unclear. Some studies suggest we're not really in an epidemic. Some people believe that we're making mental disorders up. Some people think that for the DSM, for example, there's at least 300 more diagnoses every year. Why are we struggling to do this? We touched on this briefly earlier, but I want to know from your side, what do you think could be a solution to this problem?
I think that's a really, really interesting question. And it's one that I've thought about in a lot of ways, from coming at it from different directions and talking about it to different people. And I tend to have the view that sometimes when we approach particular mental conditions directly with science in order to try to understand them and then create interventions that help or maybe even cure, that when we try the direct route, sometimes we just don't make very much progress. And at the moment, I'm thinking in particular of Alzheimer's disease, where the route really has been very direct. Let's just go for it. And one of the things that happened under the Obama administration was what's called the Brain Initiative, where the idea was that, look, maybe what we need to do is to put a lot of really deep money into fundamental questions about neuroscience that we really have not yet been able to address and have not answered. And that, as with many things in science, the direct approach to diseases doesn't always work. Sometimes you simply have to understand the structure and function in as much detail as you can to make the real breakthroughs. I mean, so for example, if you think about Harvey, who was interested in the heart, this was in the 17th century. And at that time, people thought the function of the heart was to make blood and to make spiritual stuff. And then Harvey goes in and he discovers, good God, it's just a pump. It's just a pump. And wherever blood is made, it's somewhere else. That's all this is. And it really transformed how we thought about the cardiovascular system. Now, under the Brain Initiative that started about 15 years ago, really fundamental research has been financed, where by fundamental, I mean, you're not just using traditional neuroscientific methods, but you're engaging across disciplines. So there's neuroscientists, computer engineers, physicists, and you go together and you try to figure out how this thing is actually working. And so my hope is that some fundamental breakthroughs in some conditions involving nervous systems will be made using these new tools, these new strategies, these new methods of analysis, because we have definitely been frustrated, even in something like Alzheimer's, where we can see rather gross changes in the brain in severely afflicted patients. But you know, for something like schizophrenia, where we can't see gross changes in afflicted patients, we're pretty sure that those changes must be subtle, and that fundamental neuroscience may help us understand. I mean, you know, one of the things we don't even really understand is why we don't see schizophrenia in other mammals. We just don't. Now, anyway,
I once read somewhere that you don't even see schizophrenia in blind patients.
Oh, that I did not know.
Yeah, that's very fascinating.
That's very interesting. Good God.
So there must be something about this visual experience that really does create, because I mean, our visual system takes pretty much most of our cortex anyway. It's got a large chunk dedicated to it. So that's also.
Yeah. Although, you know, bear in mind that new data on visual cortex is showing that it's not quite as visual exclusively as we thought. You can find neurons that respond to touch in V1, that respond to sounds. You can find neurons that show motor activity in V1 that's unrelated to the motor activity that the animal is actually engaged in. So one of the things that's really being rethought is cortical organization. And we thought for a long time that there were these modules: vision, auditory, tactile. It doesn't look like they're modules in that encapsulated sense. So that certain structures may be dominated by visual input, but it's not exclusively visual. Okay, so what are those other things doing there? What is the nature of the processing? And we used to think it was hierarchical, and you get to the top and now you see what the thing is, and namely it's a bicycle. It's not like that. So it isn't hierarchical, it isn't modular. And so what the heck is it? And so I think one of the things that's very exciting about neuroscience right now is that new tools for recording millions of cells at once, for example, new tools, new methods of analysis, new computational ideas from engineers are allowing us to make discoveries that are really changing the old background of what we thought we knew about how nervous systems worked.
Do you take the computational view in neuroscience currently as like the framework that you think best fits it? For example, the Bayesian theories of brain?
Well, I think that computational strategies ultimately will be essential. I don't think we have any, I mean, it's very clear that that's what neurons are doing are computational things. And in some instances, we actually know what the computations are. But it's very difficult because no neuron acts entirely on its own. I mean, it's in a family, so to speak, or it's in a widespread community. And one of the things we do know about anesthesia, like anesthetics like propofol, is that when you're under propofol, these long-range community connections disappear, and the activity is very local.
Yes.
So that's actually another bit of data that's relevant to how we think about consciousness. And it doesn't tell us what consciousness is or how it works or why we have it or any of those things, but at least it's progress. I mean, at least it gives us something to build upon and to take the next step. Okay, so that's what happens under propofol. What happens under attention? And as you know, Michael Graziano is one of the people who works on that. So I think progress can be made, but it does seem that really fundamental computational tools are needed in order to address what's going on, especially in cortex, but not only in cortex, in subcortical structures, even in the spinal cord.
Do you think we're going to be able to make consciousness in other beings, sort of artificial intelligence, machine consciousness?
I don't know. I think that it's very hard to predict. When we know how it's produced in biological brains, we may want to produce it in other brains, or we may not, or we may not be able to. I mean, one of the trouble with artificial brains right now is of course, they're tremendously inefficient. They use vast amounts of energy. You know, my brain runs on about the same as a 10-watt light bulb. Whereas, I mean, brains are incredibly efficient. Whereas, you know, even just this dinky little computer that I'm using to talk to you uses way more energy than my brain. Well, gee, that's kind of interesting. I mean, what is it about biological organization that is so efficient that we haven't even begun to copy in silicon brains, in AI?
Before we close off, Patricia, I mean, this is this question I like to ask my guests because it seems like the viewers and listeners really love this. Have you had to recommend books? Because they want to know. I mean, you're a leading thinker in the field of philosophy, neuroscience, neurophilosophy. If you had to recommend books to the audience, or authors, anyone who you recommend they should read, who would those people be? At least 5.
Well, yeah. At least 5. Oh, you should have warned me about this so that I could pile them here and then show you. Yeah, that's kind of tough. I mean, David Anderson has a new book out. And pardon me?
I said, sorry, could you repeat that? I just missed what you said there.
Yeah, David Anderson, who's at Caltech, has a new book out, the name of which actually escapes me. You know, it would be better if I could sort of remember everybody's name and everybody's name of the book. But Kevin Mitchell, who is a really interesting neuroscientist in Ireland, has a new book out that's relevant to free will. And it sounds so much more sensible because he's coming at it from a neurobiological point of view. And I have not read it yet, but I do actually plan to read that.
And growing up, any philosophers, writers that you think should be fundamental for someone to read who loves this field and wants to know more about it? Are those ones who influenced you?
I think probably David Hume influenced me more than most. You know, it's his writing is very clear. He's very sensible. He doesn't sort of get bogged down in really obscure things in the way that Hegel, for example, does. And certainly David Hume was very important to me as an undergraduate and actually as a graduate as well. And I think his work on morality, where he doesn't try to hammer out a universal law or any of this nonsense, where he's just very sensible about what's actually going on. I think he would have been a neurobiologist if he'd lived in our time. But David Hume's influence.
David Hume happens to be one of my favorite philosophers. So I think we have that in common at least. Lost you there for a second, Patricia. Can you hear me?
No, I think it was probably at this end. Sometimes this my internet's a bit iffy here. I'm not sure it's the location or what.
I think so.
Anyway,
Patricia, I think where were we? Oh, yes. So I was saying David Hume actually is one of my favorite philosophers. So I think
yes,
he is brilliant.
Well, he's so clear.
So thank you so much, Patricia, for this amazing interview. I mean, I've been looking forward to chatting to you for such a long time. And this podcast has given me that opportunity because I admire your work so much.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Well, thank you so much for this. It's been such a pleasure. Yeah, really, really enjoyed it. I don't always enjoy these things.
I'm glad you enjoyed it this much. It makes me feel so much better as the host. Thank you. And I think the listeners and the viewers have taken at least one step closer to the mind-body solution. So thanks so much for that.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.